Okay, so I'm going to continue doing a bit of a reaction video to Nick Freitas's long 2+ hour video, 25,000 plus words, on why coexistence with the left is no longer possible. And he began this, I guess a few weeks after Charlie Kirk died. He'd issued a incendiary tweet saying this was like a war. Of course, at that point, and even now, there wasn't any clear sense that the shooter's ideology was particularly left-wing. In fact, as far as we know, he was Mormon and grew up in a right-wing background. But the right wing clearly has used Kirk's assassination to build up this case for more repression in a way. And yeah, I'm just finding his argument very disingenuous. There's a tactic. Jim Stewartson, who writes the Mind War Substack, talks about Darvo, which is this right-wing tendency to defend, attack, reverse victim and oppressor. And I think he does a lot of that. He's very concerned about the Democrats, what he calls the left. I mean, it's such a weird conflation of lefts. It's so anyway, I don't even consider the Democrats left, but apparently now the Democrats in the US are left. Yeah, so I thought I would just keep going a little bit, and I'm probably not going to make it through the whole video because it goes on forever. But I mean, one of the main points, that I was making last time, which I think is still essential, is Freitas, like Matt Walsh, like a lot of these people, believes that he knows the truth. At the end of this podcast, he says, "I believe in Christianity because it is true." Whereas God is offering an objective truth, an objective morality for which he is the author, and it's not up to us to decide what that truth is. It's not for us to decide what the morality is. We discover it, it is revealed. So essentially, these people are fanatics in that sense, in which they have decided that their ideology, their belief system, their faith is absolute truth, and therefore there's kind of no argument with that, which has always been the problem with fanatics. And yeah, I mean, and I've also expressed that I'm not a secular materialist. He seems to think that most of the left are secular materialists or scientific atheists or whatever. I'm a esoteric Christian in my own way through the thoughts of Rudolf Steiner and so on. And I'm also a analytic idealist in that I follow Bernardo Kastrup's work and think that it's much more likely that consciousness is the foundational reality, sort of primordial awareness, which is also what Tibetan Buddhism talks about, and everything is emerging from this like deep structure of this sort of primordial awareness, kind of like the objects in a dream. And yeah, and this actually gives us a way of approaching different religions and archetypal structures and ideologies that I think gives them more credibility and more viability than the traditional religions hold otherwise, but also yeah, allows us to think about them differently. So I'm going to play some more of Freitas, who I guess was a Marine Special Forces and ran for...
This is no longer a discussion between, this is no longer a civil discussion between fellow countrymen on trivial matters, right? Or even important matters. This is a war, and I was very specific in how I said this. This is a war between diametrically opposed worldviews. And that's what like Speaker Don Scott, oh, I can't believe this can't be true. Yes, it can. It absolutely can. Why? Because I can point to everything you want within society.
Speaker Don Scott, I guess, is the head of the state senate in Virginia, and when Freitas made this comment that it was a war, the House Speaker Don Scott condemned his remarks. Yeah, so anyway, we'll go on.
I can point to the roles that you believe that government should play. I can point to the things that you want taught in our schools. I can point to all the things that you want in the public space, subsidized by taxes, codified by law, and enforced by the government. And I can say, I can't accept that.
Yeah, it's interesting just his like tonality of this kind of like freaked out, like frenzy, like somebody is really trying to take away his property. And, I mean, yeah, the whole point of the U.S. was to have this separation of church and state. So, in schools, science is supposed to be taught. You can still have your different religious beliefs or believe whatever you want, but there's a consensus-based reality, a coherent reality that we've agreed upon. Yeah, he must be connected. Yesterday I interviewed this guy, Frank Schaeffer, whose father, Francis Schaeffer, wrote the Christian Manifesto and was part of the kind of evangelical movement, kind of the forerunner to this modern, hyper-politicized evangelical movement, which there's something called like the Seven Mountains movement. And that's the idea that these sort of evangelical Christians need to take over these 7 areas of life in the United States. And that includes, business, media, politics, family, and so on. So yeah, this was, I guess, started in the 90s maybe, and became more prevalent in the 2000s. And now obviously they're all about it, that, because they possess this quote unquote absolute truth of this fanaticism of this Christianity, they get to impose that on everybody else. And that's what they're trying to do. Trump is like the Trojan horse for, these zealots in a way. It's sort of like the American version of the Taliban, from my perspective. And ironically, I know they would throw that back at me and say, you're because they say leftism is a secular religion. Well, actually, I'm not even a secularist. I believe that there is a transcendent reality, and I've experienced it directly through different visionary states of consciousness and so on. Anyway, let's go on.
If that's true, if Don Scott and I want 2 very, very different worlds, and Don Scott is not willing to live and let live, Don Scott will absolutely use the government to impose these things. How is that not a diametrically opposed worldview where Don just expects me to surrender? And what happens if I don't surrender? Well, it's okay if they do bad things to me. It's okay if they take my property. It's okay if they take my children away. It's okay if Charlie Kirk gets murdered.
So I don't know. Once again, the extremism is just so ridiculous. I mean, no Democrat lawmaker, House Speaker in the Virginia, whatever, is trying to take away this guy's property or his children. How does he reach these extreme? I mean, it's all some kind of like weird, I don't know, projection or something. I don't even know. But it's just it goes on and on. I mean, these guys have. I guess another thing that really terrifies me, I would say, worries me about this rapid movement into this far right reactionary kind of thing, is you can feel they're all hyping each other up, and they're all trying to get further and further into this trance state where they have this demonized opponent, of the left, the Democrats. I mean, one of these guys, Jack Posobiec, wrote a book called Unhumans, and in that book he talks about how, leftists, liberals, Democrats are actually not fully human, and they don't have to actually be treated like full humans. So there's a kind of like ongoing, intensifying effort to demonize, who they consider the other, and dehumanize the other. And this is, unfortunately, this is what, and I know he, would claim that the left, once again, I think it's an defend and reverse and so on. He would claim that the left is doing this, but I mean, I think it's the right wing, the Nazi militias, the ICE agents. I mean, they're the ones who seem to be gearing up or trying to convince themselves that they're under such a terrible threat that they have to take extreme measures, like internment camps or mass executions. I mean, in the Posobiec book, which I'm sure he knows about, maybe even agrees with, they talk about how Pinochet is the model for what should happen in the U.S., and they talk about Pinochet's helicopter killings, and they basically took dissidents up and they would torture and kill them. Apparently, they would take pregnant women, and they would wait till the baby came out. They would give the baby to a family that was following their thing, and they would then kill the mother right after. Anyway, so yeah, things are getting pretty dark, and as I said, I don't necessarily feel this guy is disingenuous, but I feel that all these right-wing guys over the last decade are like they're in this like recursive loop of with each other, where they're hyping themselves up into this kind of like trance state. in order to be able to move into the next phase of whatever this operation is in America. And I'm hoping by calling it out, maybe I can switch, get some people to break out of this state that everybody seems to be in.
Because he's a heretic. He's standing in the way of this glorious progress, this utopia that we're eventually going to arrive at. Now, Don Scott is smart enough to say, well, we're not going to say that out loud. And of course, we want this to happen eventually over time through.
Once again, he's talking about this. I don't even know this guy, Don Scott. He's an African-American. He's the House Speaker of the Virginia Congress, whatever. I'm sure he's not some zealot seeking some kind of I don't know. It's just such projection.
Various legal processes. But there's no question that that's what they're going toward. And there's no question that there is no room for me to live differently than what they insist upon. Well, how do we know that?
See, this is just, once again, I just think this is reversal because it's these guys who now, if you read the Seven Mountains Manifesto or whatever, they're talking about the U.S. becoming a, Christian nationalist ethno-state where they have the capacity to, kind of dominate and control. There's another video I watched where he's very excited about the Supreme Court dismantling the Voting Rights Act, which was set up so that, it allowed some level of proportional representation for minorities, for African Americans. So if that goes away, then you'll have states like Louisiana where there are no black representatives at all.
Well, in the areas where the left, as we've just described it, has been allowed to govern, to control social, political, religious, to the extent that they allow religious institutions to exist.
Of course they allow religious. The whole basis of our Constitution is the separation of church and state. Anybody can pray in any way they want as long as they're not, being aggressive against other people. This is just so annoying.
What has happened? Were there a bunch of people in the Soviet Union? For instance, I brought this up several times. There have been numerous attempts within the United States for people to set up secular atheist communes. Secular atheist communist environments where they're all free to come and go as they please.
Okay, well, first of all, he always makes these jumps over and over again. That's what these guys do from, I don't even know what he's talking about. We'll learn. Secular atheist communes. I have no problem with that. I've actually been, no, they weren't even necessarily secular and atheist, but I've been to a few intentional communities. I went to Twin Oaks in Virginia, and it was quite beautiful, actually. So I don't know what he's, but then he makes that switch from communes to communists, All right, we'll see what happens.
And they rule things democratically, but they operate as essentially Marxist communes or some version of socialist communes. And what happens to them? Well, they all fail.
Well, once again, they haven't all failed. Twin Oaks is an example of one that's very successful and has gone on for a very long time. But there are other ones too. But also it's who cares? I don't get where he's, but anyway, look at his face, how terrified he is of something or other.
Well, why do they fail? Well, because they're subverted by capitalist intrigue. The government doesn't come in and shut down these communes. They're allowed to act. They're allowed to operate. Now, here's what I want you to do. I want you to show me the capitalist Christian communes that are allowed to exist within Soviet-style governments. Oh, they're not. They're considered subversives and enemies of the state. They're either sent to labor camps or...
Yeah, he just keeps setting up these straw men. Yes, Soviet-era communism sucked. Nobody wants that here. Nobody's talking about that here. Marxist atheist efforts, to reconstruct society as in China. China apparently is backing away from that now, and now that they're sort of allowing people to practice Taoism and so on again. But the efforts by these societies to dismantle religion, in retrospect, was bad. They should have allowed people to practice what they wanted.
Or they're killed. So let's be very, very clear here. Within the Christian market-based economy civilizations, we allow for communists.
So Christian market-based economy? What the hell is he talking about? He's just... every phrase is like a rhetorical trick in a way.
Secular atheist communists to attempt to live out their ideology free from government oppression.
Cool. And so are, Christian nuts, as long as, or Muslim, whoever, Hasidic Jews, fine. Like, let everybody do their thing. That's the whole point of America, dude.
But the reverse does not happen in those societies for which the left controls the means of power.
But I mean, it's just so stupid. I mean, it's like the left controls the means of power. I mean, is he talking about like Norway and like Sweden and like France? Like those are way more socialist countries than here. And yeah, as far as I can see, they allow, the same amount of freedom. And he's using this bugbear of 1950 Soviet communism that nobody wants that anymore. Anyway, it's ridiculous. I mean, does North Korea, to go in the other direction of where like, Trump idolizes, North Korea and so on, do they allow a lot of religious freedom and expression? I doubt it.
That's why they're diametrically opposed, and that's why one side will win and one side will lose. That's it. I'm sorry. That's how it's going to be.
I mean, anyway, I mean, it's just, it's these, I guess also like these guys are deliberately provocative and offensive, because that's also how you get reactions, how you build your media platforms and so on. And I just, I guess I wanted to do these videos because I feel like nobody's taking these people to task or really looking at what they're saying and the language that they're using and so on. So I'll keep doing that until I run out of steam, I guess. But yeah, it's pretty tragic.
So the question becomes, when we look at the strategic framing of this, and this is the part Christian asked me about this, is like, could you put this in military terms? Yeah, I can. So there's a common kind of planning guide that we use in the military called MET-T. Now they've changed it to MET-TC and they've added other things. But here's what it stands for: mission, enemy, terrain, time, troops, and then the C was like civilians on the battlefield. So if the mission is to defeat this version of leftism, and
once again, this version of leftism, which hardly exists. I mean, of course, there is a Communist Party in the U.S. and so on, but he's conflating that with like this guy Don Scott, who's like the African American Democrat Speaker of the House, and claiming that this guy wants to take his property and children away. I mean, these guys have really lost their minds.
Remember what I'm saying. Please hear me out correctly. I don't like being misunderstood. I'm not saying defeat people. I'm saying defeat an ideology. Because ultimately, I'm a Christian. I don't see my fight as ultimately against flesh and blood. I don't want, my goal is not to defeat every person who currently identifies as a leftist.
I wonder how much money this guy gets from the Heritage Foundation or from Russian. I mean, we know that so much money from oligarchs and Russia, Putin, and so on has gone into funding this right-wing media ecosystem. And of course, they do their Darvo on the left and say, oh, that that Soros funded blah blah blah. But I think it was like 100,000 per video was coming from Russia to people like Tim Pool and so on. Anyway, he probably didn't get that money, but I'm sure he's doing fine for himself.
My idea is I don't want them to be consumed or controlled by that ideology. But if that's the mission, okay, that's step one. Step two is enemy. Who is the enemy? Well, my enemy is leftist ideology, but there's a lot of people that adopt leftist ideology and...
Yeah, so once again, he hasn't really, he claims that he's defined leftist ideology, but he's made this quick, kind of like, he goes from the Democratic, people at the House who apparently are trying to get some utopian negative thing happening to kind of the, Soviet communists of the 50s. Anyway, it's crazy.
And seek to impose it. And so I have to properly recognize who falls into that.
I mean, nobody, like, when Biden was president, I think, I actually think that Biden was a much better president than people are saying. It was an unfortunate disaster that he, didn't reckon with his age and the need to have somebody else take over, and plan that out better. But, when Biden was president, I never felt, I guess there was like a time when these people felt their freedom of speech was being impinged upon. And that's also very complex because, should somebody like Nick Fuentes be allowed, full freedom of speech? I mean, I've written a few times about Karl Popper's paradox of tolerance. And the problem is that if you're in an open society where you extend tolerance to the intolerant, ultimately, if they come to power, that tolerance that you've extended to the intolerant is then used to, destroy other people's freedoms. So that's a little bit of the issue that we've ended up with in the U.S., unfortunately.
At camp, right? The next has to do with this whole idea of terrain. A good way to think of terrain is the operational environment. And the terrain in this sort of ideological fight, this sort of philosophical, theological battle, the terrain, the strategic terrain, is your culturally shaping institutions. The family, education, media, arts and entertainment, politics.
So this is Seven Mountain ideology, straightforward.
The church, that's your terrain. Troops, the troops are what assets do you have available to you in order to go and compete for this strategic terrain in order to accomplish your mission, right? And then when we look at the time, it's this idea of, okay, what time do we have in order to accomplish things that we need to? And you have a long time goal with the mission, right? You could argue that that's a mission that never stops. But you do have time that you set up for individual objectives.
Yeah, I think he's really talking about what's already taken place, to be honest. I mean, this Seven Mountains agenda has been initiated through, the Heritage Foundation and so on. I really recommend the book Dark Money by Jane Mayer, where she looks at how these right-wing oligarchs, kind of oil money and Coors family and so on, came together back in the 60s. They didn't like the direction of American society towards greater liberalism, social movements, more public education, more public goods, and they wanted to reverse that. And they, had a series of meetings where they built up a war chest and so on. And then they really went after it, strategically and tactically, knowing that it would take them a number of decades. And so what we're seeing with this captured Supreme Court, who are really voting against constitutional principles, in my perspective, and everything that's happening right now in the U.S., is the success of this dark money agenda from the 60s way back. And it's already happened, Nick. I mean, you guys have won this round. Hopefully it's not the end of the war, but congratulations.
Right, so that's an idea of what we're talking about here. And that's the framework that we're going to use. And I know some people are uncomfortable with that, but it is what it is at this point. I was very uncomfortable with Charlie Kirk getting murdered on stage. I was very uncomfortable with the way that the left responded to that.
It's just like the way that the left responded. I mean, I haven't really seen, except for some total marginal people who, the left basically responded by saying, "Oh, this was a tragedy. Maybe we should think about gun control." Anyway, whatever.
And while I have no intention of ever participating in, or
I just noticed all the guns on his wall. Yeah, I guess he's ready to defend whatever he's...
giving aid and comfort to the idea of returning evil with evil, I am commanded to overcome evil with good. I do think that there's a lot of Christians, there's a lot of conservatives, that they are very, very...
I really don't remember much about Christ in the Bible picking up arms. I don't remember him carrying a sword or trying to shoot arrows at his enemies or whatever, but whatever.
Quick to point out in Romans 12 where it says, bless those who curse you. They're very, very quick to point out in scripture where it says to love your enemies. These are commands, they're not suggestions. But you know what they skip over? Romans chapter 12, verse 9, abhor what is evil. We have spent way too much time in this country making evil ideas and concepts comfortable, tolerated. And I'm not doing it anymore. And I'm not doing it because I'm mean. I'm doing it because I honestly and earnestly believe that these concepts and ideas harm people.
Yeah, right. I mean, belief isn't enough, Nick. You actually have to use logic and reason. And just because you grew up in a certain faith and an ideology it's not, and just because a scripture even says something, like come on.
And so that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to fight to overcome evil with good, but I'm going to abhor evil because it destroys the very thing I'm trying to save, which is people. Okay. Now, that was pretty heavy. So, of course, I'll use that heavy moment to segue into True Classic. True Classic has been a great sponsor of this show. Okay, now we're going to get into, we're going to use this concept of mission, enemy, terrain, time, troops. And if you're uncomfortable with this, let me remind you something. They've used the model against us. They have used the model against us. And if you don't believe that, we're going to show you some quotes. We're going to show you some quotes, right? So when we look at the key terrain, the things I mentioned before, the individual, the family, education, media, arts, entertainment, politics, all of that stuff, right? We're going
Seven Mountains again.
to show you things that the left has been saying, not just in the last 10 years, right? We're going to show you this line that connects all the way back to Karl Marx, that connects back to Antonio Gramsci and the long march through the institutions, which we've talked about before. So Christian, take us away a little bit on this whole idea of Gramsci's cultural hegemony.
Yeah, so we did an episode not too long ago, actually, on this topic, and we titled it something along the lines of the most dangerous Marxist you've never heard of. Well, hopefully a lot more people on the right have heard of Gramsci over the last year, certainly over the last couple of weeks. Antonio Gramsci was an Italian Marxist who effectively more or less tried to overthrow the government of Italy around the same time of the revolutions that were taking place after World War I. He didn't literally do it, but he was certainly the leadership. He was the head of the Italian Communist Party. And he ended up losing out in the power struggle to Mussolini. And so instead of becoming a communist state, Italy became a fascist state. And when Mussolini took over, he threw Antonio Gramsci in prison. The irony being that at one point in time, Gramsci actually praised Mussolini when he was a socialist.
Yeah.
But Gramsci in prison...
He praised Mussolini when Mussolini was an international socialist. As soon as he became more of a national socialist, then they...
Yeah. So in prison, Gramsci had a lot of time to write, and he had one big question on his mind, which was, why did Lenin succeed and I failed? And he wrote hundreds and thousands of pages in his, over a decade in prison before he passed away. He wrote the prison notebooks, and one of the things that he...
Yeah, I just, we are basically living in an oligarchy. I mean, if you look at, the minimum wage, and, this was also Democrats and Republicans have colluded on this. I think it was like 2008, 20 years ago or something. The minimum wage was $7.50. It's still apparently $7.50. The amount of billions of dollars that people like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg have made, in that time, even over the last 5 years, the concentration of wealth, the amount of billions of dollars that Trump has made, since he became president through crypto scams and deals that are very questionable. I mean, he's getting away with things that you can't even imagine. It would be a joke if Biden had tried to do 1 gazillionth of the things. I mean, Trump is also now putting out videos of himself flying on a jet plane over, millions of Americans who are protesting fascism, shitting on them, and so low grade, so depressing, so disgusting, and yet these guys don't really seem to have any problem with that. Yet somebody who wanted to maybe help. I mean, not that communism is perfect, although I think Karl Marx is actually really, a lot of his thinking is pretty extraordinary. Somebody who wanted to help maybe the workers to have a bigger stake in society. Yeah, of course, that person has to be demonized.
He concluded more or less is that, look, the bourgeois classes, as he described it, using very typical Marxist language, have constructed a cultural hegemony that guarantees that their worldview ends up prevailing. One of the biggest conclusions that Gramsci came to was that it's not good enough to just march out into the streets and stage a general strike or an uprising or an insurrection. That's the way that they did it in Russia.
Yeah.
That can't be done in Western Europe or Southern Europe or in the United States, in large part because the culture is too bourgeois.
Well, let's keep something in mind here. Marx is the one that
Actually, listening to this now, I totally get something which I had heard before but hadn't really sunk in, that among the things that the far right did, like the Heritage Foundation and all these groups, and these Christian groups like the Seven Mountain, whatever it is, they actually studied the leftist ideas around how do you establish cultural hegemony, or Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals, how do you build, effective grassroots movements and so on. And they assimilated those ideas and added them to their toolkit, along with neurolinguistic programming, along with psyops and so on, and along with all the military stuff that he's talking about and so on. So, but meanwhile, on the sort of, the other side, which unfortunately is very, muddy, because you do have some more extreme leftists, and then you have the sort of liberal Democrats who are still bought into the establishment system. There hasn't really been any similar effort underway, although there are more people, as we saw from the recent No King's March, who are feeling that this is wrong and would like a non-oligarchic and more participatory democratic society. But the right's capacity for strategy, tactics, organization, and then for, because they have the money also to look at psyops, you look at psychological programming, build media networks like Fox that basically, figure out algorithms and so on. And then also assimilate leftist models like Hegemony from Gramsci, or like Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals, has really made them a very powerful force that's taken over America from a minority position right now.
Predicted that it would be the countries that were going through what he called late stage capitalism would be the ones that would throw off the yoke of the capitalist, contradictions, and the proletariat would seize the means of production. And to your point,
yeah, and it should be pointed out that for Marx, it would never have been a country like Russia or China that would have been able to institute Marxism or communism properly. And in fact, if we look at it now historically, we can see that those countries, which were kind of still very feudal and backwards, basically used communism to industrialize, to pull themselves into kind of like the modern world, done very, very brutally, with a lot of mass death and destruction and so on. So ironically, it could still be the case that it could be the collapse of a society like, the UK or America or whatever, that might actually be the precondition if you had an advanced industrial society that could experiment with some of the ideas legitimately that somebody like Marx wrote about.
Yeah, but it didn't happen in any of those countries.
It happened in Russia and China.
Were farther along the path of capitalism than Russia and China were. And so he chalked it up to this idea of, well, you've got these cultural institutions which protect this way of thinking or this system. And so you've got to overthrow those if you actually want to take over a country.
Yeah, and if you do that, then you might not even need to stage the violent uprising, because the culture will be so subverted, right? I mean, from his perspective, it'll be cured, but it'll be so changed from within that we will create the very Marxists rather than stage the uprising and institute the dictatorship of the proletariat. And, subsequent left-wing political activists and Marxists ran with that. Eventually, by the time you get to the 1960s, Rudi Dutschke in West Germany came to a very similar conclusion. And he's the one that took Gramsci's writings and coined the term long march through the institutions. We associate that with Gramsci, but Gramsci never actually used that exact language. That came out of Dutschke. But I mean, again, he was pulling straight from Gramsci.
Well, he's pulling straight from Gramsci and from Mao, because the Long March is a reference to what Mao did when he was fighting the.
But instead of you staging a guerrilla uprising, right, where you're getting this people's war, where you're getting the peasants that are in the fields taking up rifles to overthrow the whole countryside surrounds the city and everything. Yeah. He's saying you're going to do it through the universities. Yeah. You're going to do it through the press.
And what's interesting is it wasn't.
I'll have to research this. This is not actually a piece of history that I know about.
Just, Western Marxists that adopted this way of thinking. The Soviet Union also, they had a thing called active measures. And Yuri Bezmenov talks about this because Yuri Bezmenov had kind of worked in Soviet media, and he'd worked in conjunction with the KGB. And when Yuri Bezmenov came to the United States, he talked about this. He goes, well, yeah, he goes, there was active measures, there was programs within the Soviet Union that were meant to essentially, he doesn't use this term specifically, but to essentially use Gramscian tactics to take over the culturally shaping institutions within a capitalist country or a Western nation for the purposes of demoralizing them, undermining them, and then subverting them. And so if you look at, okay, what was the...
I mean, it seems like every imperial power does this. I mean, the US certainly used culture. Some of those things actually have been demolished by Trump for whatever reason, like the what's called the Voice of America or whatever. Anyway.
What's the mission of the left? Well, the mission of the left is to essentially overthrow the United States as it's been created. And as it was created predominantly on a Christian worldview with respect to our morale.
Yeah, once again, I mean, I don't know which left he's referring to. Sure, there's some communists, very extremists, who might want that, but I think most of us, I think would like what Bernie Sanders talks about, like progressive taxation. I mean, universal health care, decent social services, also a plan to deal with artificial intelligence and job replacement when they're talking about half of all jobs being annihilated in 10 years. Ecological regeneration, like dealing with the ecological crisis, like dealing with the climate crisis. Not supporting genocide in Israel and all that stuff. Helping people, not dismantling the FEMA so people, are just going to suffer when these emergencies hit. Not allowing for further wealth concentration. If that's like super leftist to him, I mean, nobody wants to take away his blue house or his kids or whatever.
And ethics that largely informed the structure of our government and the sort of like rights that we appreciate. It was formed around certain classical liberal notions of representative government, individual liberty, personal responsibility, property rights, freedom of speech, freedom of religion. These things were all incorporated within the United States, and it's all antithetical to Marxism. So if you want a Marxist end state, and that is all roads on the left lead back in some way, shape, or form to some version of Marxism. If you want that, you must necessarily overthrow what the United States was created to be. Not just slavery, not just the things you don't like about maybe early American history. You must overthrow fundamentally what the United States is. Okay, so that's their mission.
I think it's much deeper than overthrowing the U.S.
I agree. Right? I'm using the United States as an example. They're trying to overthrow Christianity. They're trying to overthrow, yeah. they're trying to. Well, again, I think it goes back to the garden, right? You will be like God. So that's pretty tempting to somebody, right? So if it's overthrowing.
So once again, it's just this weird conflation where suddenly it goes from the Democratic guy in the House who didn't agree that we're in a, war to the end, between ideologies, which Nick is clearly getting now that I'm watching this from the Seven Mountain Mandate or whatever it's called, to this idea that the left is engaged in a war on reality. Now, I mean, if I'm honest, I do have questions around a lot of the structures of this society. And in many ways, I do think, indigenous cultures were preferable. And even this idea of going from, land ownership and private property to stewardship or usufruct, as somebody like Murray Bookchin talks about. Yeah, I mean, I'm interested in all that stuff. Do I think that's going to happen in the near term here? Only if Trump and his maniacs bring about a massive collapse of our economy, and people are forced to survive like that. Otherwise, yeah, I think we could have seen, more like a democratic socialist-ish, kind of Bernie Sanders-ish, progressive taxation, decent health care, decent education. but we're getting something else instead, it seems.
Doing that, but we're looking at the practical notion of how is it being applied in the United States. They see Christianity as the enemy. They see concepts of objective truth as being the enemy. They see concepts.
It's just every sentence, man. Christian, I don't think, I mean, okay, so, you know, there might be strident Marxists who see Christianity as the enemy. You also had like liberation theology, where you had, you know, Catholic priests in Latin America and other places who, you know, decided to support, you know, peasant movements, worker movements, and so on. It's not a monolith. He just has this monolithic ideology that he's trying to imprint on his, unfortunately, large audience who have already been captured by this ideology.
Of objective morality as being the enemy, which those are all rooted in Christianity. But they also...
Objective truth and objective morality are all rooted in Christianity. Yeah, man, I mean, I guess he's right that I mean, you know, first of all, I don't think as the left is I mean, I don't even know what to say. You know, what makes him, anyway, it's so painful.
See capitalism, free market economics as the enemy. They see private property rights as the enemy. They see free speech as an ultimate enemy because they don't, again, this is the reason why they are so...
I mean, who is going after free speech? I mean, when, you know, I mean, yeah, sure, in Soviet Russia, you know, which was a dictatorship, or in modern Russia, which, you know, which was a dictatorship, or in China, which is a dictatorship, you know, you don't have free speech. But now we're seeing in America, you know, they're trying to dismantle free speech protections. I mean, Trump has just issued an executive order where they're saying that, you know, anti-traditional values, anti-Christian, anti-traditional morality, anti-capitalism, these are now like preconditions for, you know, domestic terrorism or violence. They can actually do like pre-criminal investigations. So I've never in my life in America felt that I couldn't say what I want until now under this right-wing regime. So who is, you know, and you know, maybe these guys did feel for a number of years that their free speech was also being threatened. Like you couldn't go out and say you want to put people in gas chambers or whatever, and now they can. But yeah, I think it's a really good question that, you know, he would never be self-reflective enough to think about it. Is, you know, it is the threat from free speech. But I never had an issue with a Christian or a Muslim or, you know, a Buddhist practicing their religion. But, you know, he seems to have a big problem with people having different beliefs than he does.
You know, hungry for things like hate speech laws and shutting down their opponents that have a platform, because to them, you engaging in that kind of free speech is a form of heresy, right? So there's a reason why that all has to be overthrown. That's the enemy. So the enemy is Christianity, free market economics, capitalists, you know, all that stuff, private property.
Yeah, it's not really that's the enemy. I mean, from my perspective, it's just like, it's just really the best that we can do, you know, like having systems that are just based on, you know, exploitation, on kind of obsolete scriptures and old ideologies that trap people in these paradigms and ways of life that I don't see that. I mean, you know, yeah, I don't know.
Property rights. So, okay, mission enemy, terrain. What is the terrain? This is what Gramsci and Herbert Marcuse and Duschke, this is what they were all talking about. You can't just run into the United States and start shooting. Because
now they can.
Because we shoot back, right? Well, you know what I'm saying? Because we shoot back. Right? We will match that energy, right? And so they were never successful. And again, they made attempts. They made attempts early on. They made attempts through anarchist assassinations. They made attempts through the civil rights movement. They made attempts through, you know, the Weather Underground.
Right, but how many, you know, leftist organizers were either killed or imprisoned on trumped-up drug charges in the 60s and 70s? I mean, yeah, it's just it's reversal. I mean, I guess the U.S. has always been, you know, nearly a authoritarian system, and now it's just nakedly so supporting these guys' values. I mean, yeah, I mean, I didn't really like liberalism, like under, you know, Obama and Clinton, and sort of like a technocracy that, you know, like the what was it called, the Carl Schwab and the World Economic Forum and all that stuff. I didn't really, approve of that either. But yeah, this is not good either.
Tried to kick off a series of race wars, which they thought would bring about the fall of capitalism and the rise of leftist ideology. It didn't work. There's a reason why people like Bernardine Dorn, when they got arrested for trying to blow up police stations and start race riots and wars, then went into academia. There's a reason why when you read Rules for Radicals.
I mean, was she supposed to be like a janitor? I mean, I don't see. I mean, anyway.
Who, by the way, Hillary Clinton wrote her thesis on that. Gramsci's letters, prison letters, you want to know how they got translated into English into U.S. academia? Guess who did it? It was Pete Buttigieg's father. He's the one that led the group that translated Gramsci's writings into English and put it into Western academia or American academia. You look at Barack Obama, heavily influenced by Saul Alinsky, by Angela Davis, by all these people. Angela Davis was heavily influenced by her.
I mean, I wish Obama had been more influenced by the left. I mean, unfortunately, from my perspective, Obama is the main reason we've ended up in this catastrophe, socially, politically, and ideologically, because when he had, I mean, David Sirota is very good about this. When he had a huge popular mandate, he had a big backing, all these people wanted to volunteer. They'd all worked really hard for his campaign, and he kind of dismantled that volunteer structure. And he then, the way he handled the 2008 financial crisis was basically just to do whatever the financial industry wanted. Nobody from that industry was ever prosecuted. None of the Wall Street traders or the hedge fund people who were, kind of taking people's mortgages away and so on. So, yeah, unfortunately, I wish Obama had a little more leftist fire in him personally.
Herbert Marcuse, right? So there's a straight line from Marx.
Wish he would get into Marcuse. I'm actually a huge Herbert Marcuse fan. I recommend his book, Eros and Civilization. Yeah, I mean, fascinating thinker. Frankfurt School in general is super interesting. It's too bad that, I guess he's read them enough to hate them.
To Gramsci, I would say there's a straight line from the serpent to the Garden of Eden to this, but that's where you get into this idea that, okay, if this is our guerrilla warfare, if our guerrilla warfare is not going out into the streets and shooting and armed resistance, if our guerrilla warfare is taking over the culturally shaping institutions.
He is so threatened by the left. It's crazy. I guess all these guys are. I mean, their efforts to impose this sort of faux traditionalist society. Yeah, it's also kind of interesting, actually, when you think about it. Fundamentalism, I mean, this is also maybe a form of religious fundamentalism coming back, are, as some critics have noted, really actually postmodern societies. It's not like they existed like this a long time ago. So anyway, yeah, so in some ways, he's a postmodernist without knowing it, and he's terrified of this leftist ideology. He can't let it go, and he studied it, and then unfortunately they've taken the tactics, and understood them from the right perspective.
What does that look like? Okay, well, let's start reading what Karl Marx had to say about the individual and the family. Here's or did you want to bring up this one first?
Yeah, I've got, this is directly from the Communist Manifesto.
Okay.
And he writes quite a lot here. There's this paragraph in particular that I want to read, and particularly this opening sentence.
Okay, is this up on screen now?
He says, "The selfish misconception that induces you to transform into eternal laws of nature and of reason, the social forms springing from your present mode of production and form of property, historical relations that rise and disappear in the progress of production, this misconception you share with every ruling class that has preceded you. What you see clearly in the sense of ancient property, what you admit in the case of feudal property, you are, of course, forbidden to admit in the case of your own bourgeois form of property. Abolition of the family, even the most radical flare-up of this infamous proposal, even the most radical flare-up at this infamous proposal of the communists. On what foundation is the present family, the bourgeois family, based? On capital, on private gain. It is completely developed form. This family exists only among the bourgeoisie. But this state of things finds its complement in the practical absence of the family among the proletarians, in the public prostitution. The bourgeois family will vanish, as a matter of course, when its complement vanishes, and both will vanish with the vanishing of capital. Now, there's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah.
The biggest thing that I want you, and when I say you, I mean the audience, to get out of this is kind of the opening here, where he says, the selfish misconception that induces you to transform into eternal laws of nature and of reason, social forms spring from your present mode of production and form of property. What he's getting at is that what you say is eternal and true is actually a social construct, is not neutral, is not transcendent, is not objective.
I totally agree with Marx there. I don't know. I'm curious what people say. Let me know in the comments.
You see how somebody like Gramsci can read this and eventually come to his conclusions, even if he thinks Marx is wrong about.
I mean, essentially, like, I was very struck in writing my first book, Breaking Open the Head, when I visit indigenous cultures, and you go into these kind of like traditional communities where, there are, wives and husbands and families, but there's a sort of integrated community structure, which is like an extended family. I remember being in Africa and seeing, women breastfeeding each other's children and so on. I think there's a lot of problems with the, nuclear family. Monogamy is fantastic for some people, but for many people it chafes, and that's why in the right we see all this, people cheating and scandals, whether it's Hegseth and all these guys. Because if you have sexual desires, and they have to get met outside of that container, which can become stale over time, and then that leads to lies and deceptions unless you have some form of polyamory, open relationship. And I kind of do agree that the nuclear family and the monogamous couple are these sort of props, for a whole system. Which is not to say they're not great for those people that they're great for. But I think, like, for instance, when I had a child, so many hours going into, if you're a single parent, if you don't have daycare, taking the kid to the park and so on. Whereas if we lived in sort of integral communities where, childcare duty could be shared, and I've been to some communities like that, like there's one in Tamara, which is run like that. It's much more, efficient energetically and for time and even for care. Anyway, so I think there are superior models to the nuclear family structure. And, Marx and Engels also pointed out that structure has a lot to do with how capital gets passed down through generations, and it leads to also a realm of private care. I guess I'm a leftist here. Sorry guys.
Necessarily the time or place or the mechanism through which he gets his way. Somebody like Gramsci can read something like that and be like, there's no such thing as neutral, which also means if neutrality is a lie, things that you might think are just neutral, just in the world, just naturally existing, are also a lie. The family is a lie.
Yeah, I don't think it's like nothing. There is no such thing as neutral. There is only subjective perspectives. Everybody's perspective is conditioned by psychology, by social conditions, by the ideology they've been exposed to, perhaps from my perspective also by karma and so on. So, I mean, that's okay. We still, can be intersubjective and find coherence together. And it's not a question of the family being the enemy. It's just that, are these the optimal ways to kind of like organize society and do they create the maximum amount of happiness? I think if you look at, the nuclear family, monogamous marriages and so on, a lot of people are not that happy in those structures over time. But they're sort of forced to hold on to them. People become sort of stale. I don't know. I mean, there's nothing perfect. I mean, human life in itself is inherently fragile and transitory, and passes quite quickly in some ways. But I don't know. They're so focused on enemy all the time. Enemy.
well, the family, I mean, Marx goes
Especially
on
the
to,
bourgeois conception of the family.
Marx goes, and really there was a lot of attacks on the traditional family. You actually saw this within BLM. BLM, they proudly call themselves Maoists, but it was this idea that the family is a tool of oppression. And when Marx broke this out, and when Marx was trying to appeal to a broad audience here, he looked at it from a couple different things. He thought it was a tool of oppression on men versus women. How often have you heard the feminist narrative that marriage is basically structural sexism? It's a form of illegitimate hierarchy of the man over the woman. How many times have you heard women talk about, or feminists talk about this idea that any sort of, I'm going to use a term that won't get us throttled, intimacy between husband and wife is actually a form of coercion, right? This comes from Marx. They didn't just come up with this one day. This comes from Marx. Because if you accept this version of the family, that family is not this very strong, very natural, God-ordained unit, that instead it is simply a tool of the oppressors to perpetuate their oppression. And
God-ordained unit. I mean, you know, it's just, it's offensive, actually, that he, but I guess that's what these guys are all like. They just believe they have the absolute truth. And, you know, rather than, like, you know, he could go visit like an indigenous culture, like he could go visit the Kogi in Colombia or the Bwiti in Africa, and then he can interrogate, you know, his ideas around, or Tamara, this community in Portugal, you know, whether this type of family doesn't have, I mean, you know, once again, each to their own, but I mean, you know, are there oppressive elements in you know, nuclear families over time? I mean, it feels like it leads to a lot of neurosis and a lot of unhappiness, particularly in, you know, when that's combined with economic constraints and mental health issues and so on. It's not totally not worthy of some interrogation or inquiry.
To perpetuate capitalism, well, then of course you have a moral obligation to fight against the family, to dismantle the family, to destroy the institutions which elevate the family as an integral part of society.
Yeah. Or instead of being, you know, like so destructive around it, just have more options for people. Like not everybody has to, like, you know, tax breaks go to this one structure, but, you know, what if people want to try other structures? You know, what's his problem with that?
Right? Now, again, from our worldview, we see the family as being essential. The family is, again, we see it as natural, we see it as biblical. Even the people who don't share Christianity see it as a...
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, you know, not natural if you can go to all these indigenous cultures and see kind of expanded kinship relationships. It's, you know, it's something that developed through settled agriculture. You know, even in the Middle Ages, actually, the family wasn't such a construct. This is why you can really see that this fundamentalist Christianity, Seven Mountains thing is really a postmodern expression. Yeah, even in the Middle Ages, there was a lot more fluidity. I think they talked about having like this big bed, and, you know, often, you know, when a stranger passed through, maybe they would end up connecting with the wife or something. I don't know. It's just I think there were a lot more differences in the past. And it's like this monoculturalization of reality, where these guys believe they have this fixed truth, and they've turned that into this, you know, kind of agenda of control that they want to impose on everybody else. That's how I see it anyway. Maybe you see it differently.
A very, very natural process. Like, obviously, whether you chalk it up to God or evolution or whatever, everybody is able to see there must be something going on here. When a man and a woman can come together and create another little human being, what are we supposed to do with that? And the traditional approach to this, and certainly the Christian approach to this, has been, well, because there's a framework. There's a biological and moral framework that exists between man and woman, husband and wife, mother and father. And that is the best system.
Keep it simple, stupid.
For raising up children to be able to continue on this moral framework, this biological moral framework.
It appears that this tactic, this whole frame up of this tactic appears to do the best again.
By the way, there's that whole, you know, Wilhelm Reich they haven't really talked about. There's a whole thing around, you know, the relationship between authoritarianism, or ultimately like fascism, and sexual repression and kind of character armor. I mean, maybe these guys have an incredibly wonderful, relationship and connection, but yeah, it's like that's also, religion. Freud talked about how that required like, sexual repression, culture, sublimation. So then that frustration and repression get channeled into, building stuff. Cathedrals, stock exchanges, and so on. And yeah, with Wilhelm Reich, I think talked about character armor, how it could be excessive, kind of like excessively punitive toilet training practices, or other early childhood kind of patterning that then leads to a sort of inward repression, and then outwardly that leads to these sort of authoritarian character structures who are anyways. And it's interesting to think about how it's a little bit different now than it might have been in the 30s. I'd love to see some studies on that, actually.
Against individuals who have the broken down family. As soon as they've been able to break down the family, success is like within reach for them.
It's a lot easier to conquer an atomized and isolated,
Yes.
defenseless individual
Yeah.
than
And once again, what's the main force in our society that atomizes and alienates individuals? It's actually capitalism and exploitation, and the fact that people have to fight to survive. And so, for instance, look at minority families and impoverished men who have to work minimum wage or can't even get that for $7.50 an hour, and that leads to anger and a sense of lack of self-worth, which then is acted out in relationships and so on. So if you kind of fixed the economic systems that had helped people better, you might solve some of these problems.
in a group of people,
I
right?
can't.
If you have to fight 1,000 men, are you going to fight them at once, or are you going to fight them one by one?
Well, and I can't help but to see the correlation here. We did an episode a long time ago about predators and the fact that they actually interviewed this absolute monster of a predator, and he said that he looks for a household that has no father.
Yeah.
And because he knows he can gain entrance there. And that is just it. This tactic is predatory in the exact same way.
But here's the important thing to realize. Because again, you say this, it's predatory. They're trying to destroy the family, they're trying to do all these other things. And everybody who's watching this going, I got some friends of mine that are Democrats, and they're a loving family, or they're whatever. They don't look at it as I'm trying to destroy the family. They look at it as they're trying to liberate individuals from this oppressive system.
Yes.
If you look at it that way, then all of a sudden you see the moral justification they're using, and it's not like that other person is this evil person.
There you go. I think that's a great idea. Let's liberate individuals from this oppressive system. I'm all with you, Nick. Good point.
Person sitting here going, wait a second, sitting here going, ooh, yeah, I'm going to break the. It's like, no. What we're going to do, and you can see on how they do it, because even the people on the left who have families are constantly organizing those families in such a way to where there might be certain practical considerations. I had a child with this man. But then they're constantly looking for new ways to either separate the child from the family with respect to its education, with the child's education. They're constantly looking for ways for the state to be able to intervene and to be able to provide the necessary mechanisms for raising that child, whether it be food, whether it be shelter. They're constantly trying to come up with situations where they elevate single motherhood as if it's almost something to be desired. They incentivize.
I don't know who he's talking about with this they here. It's so annoying.
Single motherhood by saying that if you leave your husband, you get these benefits. If you
Boy, does he think he's right all the time. It's just so fucking annoying.
stay with your husband, you do not, right? So you're not going to convince me that the left doesn't on some level, right? Now, sometimes that animosity manifests itself in Marx coming right out and saying, this is a horrible bourgeois, evil structure. And sometimes it manifests itself in far more subtle ways where you shouldn't be the one educating your child or raising your child. No. You need to give that child to us so you can get back into the workforce, right? Your child it takes a village, right? You're not the one that
You
should
don't
be
want to be
responsible.
just a mom.
You don't want to
do
be
you?
just a mother.
So everything that
Yeah, but once again, this is capitalism. I mean, back in the 1950s in the U.S., one member of a family could work, usually the husband, the father, almost always, and make enough money to buy a house and a car and support, 2.3 kids or whatever. And then, when we exited the Great Society in the 60s and stopped progressively taxing the wealthy and redistributing that to society, and kind of created this more intensive form of capitalism, and it ended up developing into a system where now both parents have to work. They still can't afford a home unless you're in the upper echelons of the middle class or higher. And it's not the left that did that. It's actually the force of corporate capitalism. Although there are definitely interesting ways where feminism and capitalism did kind of work together to kind of like make the system acceptable for people. And there is something there that probably does need to be looked at.
You were saying just a little bit earlier, there's one more thing that I want to read from Marx, because just listen to this and tell me if this doesn't sound familiar. He continues here right off of where we left off earlier a few minutes ago, and he said, "Do you charge us with wanting to stop the exploitation of children by their parents? To this crime, we plead guilty. But you say, we destroy the most hallowed of relations when we replace home education by social. And your education is not that also social and determined by the social conditions under which you educate, by the intervention, direct or indirect, of society, by means of school, etc. The communists have not invented the intervention of society in education, but they do seek to alter the character of that intervention and to rescue education from the influence of the ruling class."
And keep in mind, they
Does
consider...
that not sound so similar to the stuff that you've heard from progressives when it comes to education, raising children,
Randy
family creation?
Weingarten, I mean, when you hear the...
And so they will say things like, we're not trying to say dissolve or abolish the family in the sense that we eliminate having kids. Well, some of them are going that far, right? But they're saying, no. You don't understand. This has all been pre-programmed. We're trying to deprogram you from things that you think are neutral and natural. And we're saying, no, your understanding of education is not neutral.
Yeah.
It's influenced by something. And that something is this bourgeois culture that we want to eradicate.
Yeah.
And so when we say abolish the family, what we mean is abolish the bourgeois, non-progressive, non-Marxist, non-leftist interpretation of how to do these things.
Well, and they also, I mean, you see in the...
I mean, this has to be, taken into the larger context of the Christian nationalist rights turning this battle on public education. So they're defunding PBS, and they're trying to substitute, the name escapes me for the moment, that far Christian right educational network that actually has done kind of cartoons with Columbus where they talk about how slavery is basically a natural thing. So yeah, once again, unfortunately, it seems the far right, the Christian nationalist movement, has learned from Gramsci that there is a battle for hegemony that includes culture and ideology and education. And, my sense personally is that, progressive secular education is kind of, not the worst thing. And yeah, the idea is to give people the evidence and allow them to choose their own, ideology and not to indoctrinate them. I guess, one of the big things I've spoken about in my work a lot is kind of cultures of initiation, indigenous cultures, esoteric cultures, and cultures of indoctrination. And we now know that minds are very, malleable and can be shaped and easily inflected and so on. I was watching, for instance, this young woman from North Korea who escaped, I think, when she was in her early 20s, she was over 20 years old before she even had the thought that the dictator of North Korea was not some kind of like demigod, that he was actually like a human being, like her and the people that she knew. So that's that's how effective ideology and indoctrination can be. And, that's sort of the subtext here. I mean, yeah.
The way that Marx, because part of the problem here is the people were criticizing the communists, like, well, how do you replace, if if husbands and wives are no longer a thing, if mothers and fathers are merely, it's merely a biological choice to propagate the species, then who is ultimately responsible for these things? It's like, the collective. The collective is responsible for not just educating the child, the collective is responsible for raising the child. And that way, because in that way, what they see is, it's this idea is the child is now liberated from the parents and the parents are liberated from the child. And so it's all about you being, but you have to be obligated to something because somebody has to actually fulfill those roles in educating and raising. Well, the state will do that, or the dictatorship of the proletariat will do that.
Sure. I mean, once again, this is kind of like the problem of having kind of like a mass society, and yeah, I mean, probably one alternative is if you have a kind of unified community, like a integral indigenous community, and the process of childcare is being handled collectively. That's kind of, I would say, good in a way. I mean, and so when we scaled up to the mass level of giant cities and so on, where people are forced to work long hours, men and women, yeah, then we developed like daycare and after school programs and all that stuff. I mean, I don't think it's as sinister as he's making it out, but I think they don't like that these education systems and daycare systems and all that were not putting out this hardcore Christian ideology that propounds obsolete religious scripture as the absolute truth, so that people maintain in a hierarchical control structure, which is what they want, so they preserve their power.
It's important to understand that insofar as there is any difference between socialism and communism, it's that communists, Marx imagined this world where eventually no state would be necessary because you would have a complete dictatorship of the proletariat. That's their heaven. The socialists, if you're looking at Lenin's definition, it was the idea that socialism was this intermediary step between moving from capitalism to the state running everything to eventual dictatorship of the proletariat. It's just newsflash, you never get to this utopia that they're actually talking about, because what would that even look like? Does 100% of people vote on everything that you do, and then what happens? You haven't gotten rid of hierarchy. You haven't created a hyper-egalitarian society. You've just created a different dictatorship of the majority.
Yeah, so I actually agree with some critiques of Marx, and I really liked Hannah Arendt's perspective on this in her book on revolution and some of her other works, which, yeah, basically, Marx had a mistaken concept that she says goes all the way back through political philosophy, back to Plato. It actually began with the murder of Socrates, who was just a truth teller who's going around telling people, getting people to question, let's say, their established reality, and was imprisoned and ultimately killed for that. So this created this kind of tragedy in the Western psyche and separated politics and philosophy. And so with Marx, this idea is that the ultimate goal is a society that has no politics. And Hannah Arendt points out that that's a mistake, because the word politics is very negative in our world, and I have negative connotations with it. I'm sure you do too. But the root of that word is the word polis, and the root of the word polis is the free city state, like in Athens, where the free people of the society come together to make decisions together, and that's actually a basic intrinsic part of our human beingness, that we want to contribute to the collective and help the collective make good decisions. That's why I like the idea of sortition is kind of an interesting one. Like, instead of government by elected representatives, have like a random assortment of people make decisions for the whole. Or, certainly with proper use of kind of internet tools, you could have a much more participatory democratic system if people were able to get, good information, and they could, much more politically choose between all these different alternatives. But anyway, yeah, this idea of disbanding politics and the sort of dictatorship of the proletariat was a mistaken idea. I mean, I like some of other Marxist ideas, but I think that politics in its essence, I agree with Hannah Arendt, is part of our human beingness, that we want to contribute to the decisions of the collective and the community, and in a well-structured society on whatever scale that would be possible. Now, I've been very interested in Audrey Tang, who was the digital minister of Taiwan, and among the things that she instituted there were ways that anybody on the government websites could point out to something that should be done in the society, and people would vote on it. And if 5,000 people agreed that the petition was a good idea, then the government had to take it seriously and actually look into it. So, and that apparently helped restore a lot of trust in government. So I think actually making government more participatory and more democratic, which I don't think what these Christian zealots want, would be an amazing thing to do. So yeah, we're almost going to end for today, but a little bit more.
Right? You haven't gotten rid of exploitation. You've just changed the mechanism by which it's realized. But there can be no question that the traditional conception, the Christian conception of the family, they considered their enemy, and they sought to replace it.
Once again, enemy. Yeah, man, it's just like people can totally have that experience and have that life. It's good if it's good for them, but that doesn't have to be the only option for people. There can be unconventional arrangements, and you don't have to have a society that only rewards that structure with, passing assets on, through generations or tax breaks and so on. It's just, he's an ideologue, obviously.
With the collectivization of, this is another reason why there's this bizarre phenomenon. And Engels even talks about it, I think, and I can't remember if it was in a pamphlet. I can't remember. But Engels talks about this funny thing where it's, why does the concept of sex always work its way in to leftist thinking about things? And why does it always include this idea of rampant promiscuity? Why does it always include this idea of completely removing any boundaries, any bourgeois morality from and bourgeois was really just Christian morality with respect to concepts of sex, because Christian concepts of sex were sex is something that should be done between a man and a woman within the confines of marriage, both for intimacy between husband and wife and for the creation and raising of children. That's sex within the bourgeois morality, right? But in Marxist morality, sex is just a biological expression. It's just something to be enjoyed. And think about it. If there is no real heaven.
Okay, I'm going to stop here for today. This is actually an interesting discussion, but it requires more unpacking. Thanks for listening. If you are watching, remember to share, like, subscribe to my YouTube and all that stuff. And we'll come next time back with some and keep going with this. I still find it interesting.